Hi, I'm Alex and I'm going to talk to you today about the role of samplers and the role they play in modern electronic dance music. Most of the time when we talk about samplers, people straight away think of things like Contact or the Ableton, Simpler, or even Logic's own samplers. I'm not mentioning them today, I'm actually referring to a piece of hardware, an old piece of hardware, and that is the Akais. The Akais that I'm mentioning were ones that captured and sharpened transients, and they defined the sound of dance music throughout the 1990s. In particular, I'm referring to the S1000 and S1100 because those were the ones that were really changing for our music sound, and these are becoming really popular today. The reason they're becoming popular, well, it's the magic they actually bring to our music. And when I say they're becoming popular, I actually have to confess to owning over 14 of them, 5 different models, but yet 14 of these samplers. These samplers, they preserve transients. They use something called an 8-point windowed sync interpolation, which means that you could actually transpose a sample from its bass key quite high with very little artifacts. I say little artifacts, I'm possibly incorrect there really, because they bring a lot to the sound. They'll make you sound very special and unique. And that is the reason why today those pieces of kit, those pieces of hardware are actually increasing on price when you look at them on the second-hand market. They've gone up from, in the last 3 years, from about $500 up to $1,000. People though tend to be afraid of them, and they look at them and they go, oh, they've only got a tiny little window and they've got lots of buttons, I don't know how to use them. They're very simple to use once you get to grips with them. And what we're going to do now is we're going to let Rick run through how to actually use them and get them into your system.
So let's start with a basic overview of a hardware sampler. For this session, we're going to take a look at how to sample, perform some basic editing functions, and then how to assign our samples to key groups and programs. Now, as soon as we switch the sampler on, it's going to display the current OS and the amount of megawords fitted, and then the unit's going to search for a hard disk. We can skip that by just pressing the button below the text, which is F7, so we hit F7 there. Now we're going to perform the most basic operation a sampler can do, and that's sampling a sound. Now to sample in the Akai samplers, it's pretty simple. All we need to do is press the Edit Sample button there. And that's going to open the sample editing screen. Now the thing to note here is that the sampler will always boot up with 4 samples in its memory. These are sine, sawtooth, square and pulse. Now these are already selected, so we can just use the rotary encoder here to switch between them. And to play a selected sample, we can just press the Enter Play button there. Now, in order to record a sample, we first have to duplicate a sample that's already present and then record over it. I know it sounds weird, but this is 90s tech. You couldn't just sample into nothing. You either have to record over an existing sample or copy a sample to record over. Now, the basic waveforms take up so little memory in the 3200 that I just prefer to copy the waveform. So the first thing we need to do here is name our new sample, and we can do that by pressing Name on the keyboard. Now obviously the cursor is now waiting for us to input a name. Now you can just use the rotary encoder here to enter your name using the rotary encoder and the left and right buttons there. But an easier way to do this, if you look closely, is use the soft pads. You'll notice that every single button corresponds to a letter in the alphabet, and we can just tap these to enter a name, which is an awful lot quicker. So we could, for example, call this DMP. So for that, we just go DMP. And if we want to use numbers, we can just click the name and then use 1 and then click name again to move back to letters. Once we've named a sample, for example DMP1, all we need to do is press the Enter button. Now we'll be immediately asked by the sampler if we want to copy that sample, rename the original sample, or exit. Now, as I've mentioned, we can't record into nothing with an Akai. We have to record into a sample. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a sample with a new name, and then we can record over it. So I'll just choose F6, copy. And there's our new sample, which if I play this, it'll be the sawtooth sample because it's just a copy. So the next thing we need to do is decide whether we're going to record a mono or a stereo file. So we just use our cursor to move to mono, and using our rotary encoder we can change to stereo or mono. I'm going to record in mono for this example at the moment. Now you're going to notice that the only other place we can cursor to here is monitor. I don't want to talk about that yet because it involves a bit more knowledge of the sampler. So we're going to leave that for now, and we're just going to go to the first recording page. So all we need to do is look at this line here, and we can see record 1 is under F2. We just press F2. So first of all, you can see we've got the sample name there. We can move between the samples we have in memory using the rotary encoder, but I want to record over DMP1. So we can move our cursor to the mode. This is like the previous page where we can choose between mono or stereo sampling. Now the one underneath this, view there, this is because this sampler can't display a stereo image, only a mono one. So we need to decide whether we want to view the left or the right of the image there. Now obviously, if I'm recording in mono, can't change this at all. I can only view the left side of the channel. Underneath that, we've got start. Now there's 3 ways we can start this. If I set this to MIDI note there, the sampler will only start recording if it receives a MIDI note message. The next one to that is foot switch, which is self-explanatory. You can start it with a foot switch that connects down here. I generally always set this just to input level there. Now we can also set the bandwidth here from 10 kHz to 20 kHz there. And we can also set the pitch, the original pitch that we're recording, C3 there. We can change that whatever we need. So I'm going to leave that at C3. If that's a number on yours, all you need to do is press the record 1 button again. So it's a number. That's the MIDI note number. You just press the same button. We can then move over to monitor here. Now note how monitor is on here. What this means is that we're going to monitor the sample. In other words, we can hear it as it's recorded into the sampler. I'm going to leave that on for the moment. The reason we have that parameter there is if we're using a mixing desk and we may not want to hear what the sampler is recording because we may get feedback. So the final thing we need to set up is our record time. Yeah, it's that 90s tech again. You can't just press record. You have to tell it how long your sample is going to be. Now, if you don't know, you just set it long because it's not unusual to edit the sample afterwards. Now at this point, I've got to draw your attention to one of the confusing parts of the Akai samplers. You see how the recording time is fully highlighted across there? This means if I turn my rotary encoder, it's going to increase at 1 millisecond at a time. Now, if I'm going to record 10 seconds here, that means I've got an awful lot of turning of that to do. I can get that to 2 seconds there like that. It takes a long time. So what we can do is just use our cursor buttons and just move over the 2, and then I only adjust that. I'm going to set that, say, about 5 seconds, I think, because I'm only going to record a very short part. Now, one thing to note there is, as I increase this encoder, it shows how much time I have left to record down here. For example, I've got 4% of memory being used, 10%, and so forth. I'm going to set that 5 seconds. With about 32 megabytes in this, you're going to get around 180 seconds of stereo sampling time. And in mono, which I'm recording in here, you can obviously double that. Now, once we've set the basic parameters there, what we need to do is move on to the second recording page by just pressing F3 to access record 2. Now here we can check all the previous information, and using the cursor keys here, and the rotary encoder, we can change all of these. But what we're really interested in is our threshold here. Now this sets our recording threshold. Once the incoming signal breaches it, the sampler is going to start to record. Now if I play something on the keyboard now, you're going to see the incoming signal. Now obviously I need to set the threshold so that it's going to be triggered by this sample. I can easily do that by just reducing that. I can see it's breaching the threshold, so that's going to trigger the sampler. So the next thing I need to do is just press the arm button on F8 and then play it again. Okay, now it's recorded, we can actually listen to that sample by just pressing the enter play button. And we can also play up and down in pitch using an attached keyboard. I'm not going to do that at the moment because first of all I want to clean the sample up. So to clean the sample we need to edit it. So all we do is we just choose the edit one page, which is F4. Now I'm going to cover all the available sample editing techniques in further lessons. Here I only want to edit the start and end points of a sample. And we can perform this with trim, which you can see there is automatically selected. And this means we can trim our sample down, cutting away the trash from the beginning or the end of the sample. And the important buttons here are zoom in, zoom out, and these arrows here and the cut. So the first thing we need is to choose this arrow here to choose whether we want to edit the beginning or the end of the sample. I want to edit the beginning, so I can now just zoom in with F5. You can see there, the sampler is actually pretty clever. It's pretty intelligent. So it's put the cut marker at the very start of the sample there. But if it was wrong, we could always adjust it by moving to the start and turning the rotary encoder. So I'm going to say it's okay there, I'm going to cut it. I'm going to explain these later, so I'm just going to choose cut, and it's cut the beginning. So the next thing we need to do is zoom in on the end. So we go to the end of the sample, move our cursor here. Now remember that when we're adjusting this, we only want to adjust the larger numbers so we can see where we're up to. And I'm going to zoom out just so I can see a little bit more. I'm going to cut it all the way over to there. I just want that beginning piece. Cut that, and then to there. I'm just going to cut it there. Cut, cut, and I've got my sample. Now the one thing to bear in mind is that this is destructive editing. There's no undo. So if you're brand new to sampling, always save your samples to disk first. Now you can do this just from the disk page here. Now I'm going to talk about looping and other sample editing functions in a later lessons. For now, what I want to do is I want to modify our sample with an amplitude envelope. Now it's important to note here that I can't apply envelopes, filters or modulation to individual samples like this. I can only apply them to key groups, and key groups can only exist within our program. So the first job is to create a program. Now this may seem pretty complex, but it's pretty easy to understand. You see, all Akai samplers employ a hierarchy consisting of a multi, programs, key groups and samples. Now a multi is a top tier and contain multiple programs. A program is one level down and can contain multiple key groups, and key groups can contain multiple samples. Now we can edit and loop samples, but we can only apply envelopes, filters and modulation to key groups. So the first thing we have to do is create a program to hold a key group and then place our samples into that key group. So for this, we go to the edit program page there. You can probably see how the sampler is arranged in a methodical manner. We can select our program, then we do the sampling, and then we choose to edit the program. So we click on edit program there. Now in the edit program page, we need to create a new program, but like samples, we can't just create them. Yeah, it's that 90s tech again. we need to copy a program and use that, which is why the sampler loads with the test program. So like sampling, if we want to create a test program or a new program, we just press name. I'm just going to use those to wipe out everything that's there. And we'll come back. And again, I'm going to call this, say, DMP. We'll go to letters. I'm going to call it 14. Random. And then we just press enter. Again, it's going to ask, do we want to copy or rename this test program? I'm going to copy it because the test program holds the 4 sample waveforms from earlier. So F6, there's our new program in memory. And it'll even tell us we now have 2 programs in memory that you can see there. So once we have a program, we can assign a key group to that program. Now, as you can see, key groups appear in our program memory there. Now, alongside modulation options, basically our pitch bend and our LFO parameters, a choice of what audio outputs the program should use and various MIDI parameters such as what MIDI channels to receive on, so forth, panning and tuning. These are all the basic things that we tend to keep in a program, not individual samples or key groups. So what we want to do is, first of all, we need to put our sample into a key group. So we can just press F2, go into our key group. Now you can see in this page we have access to filters, envelopes, samplers, pitch, the span, and obviously we're in the key group there. Now, as I've mentioned, we can't apply filters or modulation or amplitude envelopes to individual samples. We can only apply them to key groups, which is why they're available in the key group menu here. It may sound limiting, but once you understand the hierarchy, it really isn't. So the first thing we need to do is consider how many key groups do we need in this program. If, for example, we had just a sample bass and our chord, we'd probably want to split the MIDI keyboard so that notes below C2 play the bass sample and notes above that play the sample chord. That's something we're going to do in a later session. For now, I just want the sample chord to play across the entirety of the keyboard. So I'm going to leave key group here as 1, how many key groups we have in this program. I'm going to leave it spanning C0 to G8 there. So the first thing we do is go into the span button, which is F3. This sets the sampling span of this key group. Now, as I say, I want it all the way from C0 to G8, so I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to go back to my key group there, and instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump straight over to F6 sample. This is where I can assign the samples that I want into this key group. Now you can see the key group span, C0 to G8, that's our key group there. And then we have 1 sample in this key group. As you can see, we can assign up to 4 samples to a single key group, and they can be triggered by different velocities. So I could, for example, have this sign triggered by any velocity over 60 to up to 127. Then I could add a second sample and do the same. Now, I'm just going to go over to the sample and I'm going to change that to our chord sample. There, our DMP1. Then I can go back to my key group. So I've now assigned our sample, our chord sample, to our key group. I can now access the filter. Now here you can see that the filter frequency is at 99. That's completely open. We can also look at whether the filter will track the keyboard, the key follow there, and we can also see the resonance there. We can assign velocity to frequency, LFO2 to modulate frequency, and envelope 2 to modulate frequency there. Now, this Akai sampler is only fitted with a 12 decibel low pass filter. It's the most useful type, but you could buy an IBF04 card to add further filters and additional modulation envelope. So in here now, we can see that we've got 2 envelopes too. We've got envelope 1, one written in uppercase, one written in lowercase, and envelope 2. Now, envelope 1 here is hardwired to the amplitude, and we can control the ADSR values or choose between different templates. See the different templates there, or alternatively, we can just adjust the attack the decay, take the sustain down, and the release. I'm actually going to reduce that attack down and get rid of the decay. I'm going to bring all the way up like that. Now, as I say, you may have noticed that we've actually got envelopes in upper and lower case. The upper case allows us to change the envelope shape. The lower case there, which is under F6 for envelope 1, that allows us to set how velocity affects the envelope's behavior. Velocity affects the attack, the release, note off velocity, decay and release, and the attack hold there. And that's the basic approach to sampling and performing some basic sampling editing duties in the Akai. If you're using an older or newer model, these functions will pretty much be the same, although older samplers may be missing some of the functions and newer samples may have a few additional features, but the basic process is pretty much essentially the same. And I'm going to start by sampling a drum loop, so we'll switch our sampler on and just give it a moment to wake up. I'm not interested in waiting for the hard disk, so the first thing I need to do is go into my edit sample, and I need to choose a sample in here. I'm just going to stay with the sine wave there. I'm just going to click the name button so I can rename it. I'm just going to call it drum, like that. Now enter. I can copy or rename it. I'm going to copy this because I've got enough memory. Copy it, so I've now got my drum there. I'm going to go into the first record page. I'll set that to stereo. I think a stereo signal's coming in. I'm not quite sure. I've wired this up at the moment. All of that's correct. The only thing I need to change is the record time. I'm going to change that to perhaps 5 seconds. Go to the record to page, and then obviously the only thing I need to change is my threshold there. And then all I need to do is arm the sampler. And there's my sample. So now I can just go into the first editing screen there, and I want to trim it. So I'm going to zoom in on the beginning and just check. Yeah, it's pretty intelligent, the sampler, so it kind of knows where the beginning is. I can always adjust that ever so slightly if I need to. Just take it at the beginning there. I'm going to cut that. Don't worry about these for the moment. We just want to cut it. And then finally, I want to move to the rear end of the sample. So F7 there. I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit so I can see it. I'm going to move to there, and I'm just going to edit that. So I can just get it a bit close there. I know that I'm quite close there, so I can always zoom in and have a closer look. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that away first. So that's cut. And then I can use smaller movements just to take it. Zoom in a little bit more to the end of that loop there. I'm going to cut that, cut it, and I've got the drum loop like that. So now I have the basic drum loop down, but I now want to loop the sample, and there are a number of ways we can loop samples in these machines. So we go to F3, loop. Now in this loop window, you can see here our first one is loop, and it says 1 there. Now basically what this means is we can set up 4 loop points and then set how long these loop points should loop for. So loop point 1, we could select loop point 1 and then set the time for that loop point. Then we could choose loop point 2, set the time for that, loop point 3 and loop point 4. So we have a maximum of 4 loop points. So the idea there is you set up a loop point so that the sample will play and then loop an area for a few seconds, then move to the next loop point and play that for a few seconds, then to another, and then to another before finally finishing the loop and starting all over again. That's actually really useful for creating interesting variations when you're working with breakbeats, and it's how a lot of drum and bass producers created their rhythmical variations quite quickly and easily in these samplers, and it's something we're going to look at in later seasons of sampling. For now, what I want to say is that I want to loop a part of this beat for as long as the note is held. Now, because I want to ensure that the loop continues for as long as I'm holding the note, I need to set the loop time to infinite. And the way to do that is just to go over to your loop time here and just enter the value of 9999. And you'll see it becomes hold there. So once we have hold on that loop time, the next thing we need to do is set the loop area. Now, this can be pretty confusing to those new to samplers because it's a bit different to how you'd normally think about it. But essentially, this second value here, the LNG, denotes the length of the loop. And the first value here tells us where the loop should start, not where it ends. So what we need to do, we need to begin by setting the loop length. So I'm going to set this, say, might actually go a little bit bigger than that, otherwise we're spinning for a while. Say, set the loop length about there, and then I can go to the beginning here, and I can adjust, as you can see there. I got it spot on. And that's just down to a bit of experience that I've done this so many times, I can generally tell where the loop should work. But if you're having trouble finding it, you can always kind of hit the F7 there. And if you hit this multiple times, it will try and find the best crossover point for your loop here. This is actually showing where the two are meeting, where this loop hits from here to here. And we can use a crossfade value if we can't quite get that very clear. So we could just go to our crossfade and increase that to increase how much it crossfades. Now obviously I don't need to do that because I've pretty much nailed the loop there. Now we've got join there. Now that's for joining two samples together. That's a more complex operation for layering sounds, and it's something I want to talk about when we get into creative uses of samplings and when we want to layer sounds to produce these huge basses, kicks and leads that you typically hear in tech house and so forth. For the moment, while we're working on a loop, I actually want to move over to the Edit 3 page. Now to do that, I just jump to Select and jump straight to Edit 3. Now, the first one that's selected is called Sect, which actually means sectional editing. You see, whereas we use trim to remove the beginning and end of a sample, we can use sectional editing to remove parts from within the sample. A typical application of this, for example, would be I could zoom in on a snare, a kick or a hi-hat from a drum loop and remove it. So it's easy enough. All we need to do is set the start point here of where we would place our cut, and then we set the end point here. Now you're going to notice that I keep getting a warning, start in active loop zone, and that's simply because I'm looping this area, so it's complaining a little bit saying that if you cut this out you're affecting the loop. So I'm not actually going to do it, but if I was, I just select my individual instrument by using the zoom in and the zoom out buttons. There, you see, it keeps warning me I'm an active loop. And then once you've zoomed and selected the area you want to remove, you can just press the execute button there. Now, when you hit the execute, you're going to get extract, cut, and chop. Now, extract means it will extract the selected area and create a brand new sample from it. So this means I could zoom in on a snare, I could extract it and create just a snare sample out of that loop. If I choose cut, which is F6, it's going to remove that section, but it'll then leave a gap in my drum loop. So my drum loop will play where the snare occurs, there'll just be a gap, and then it'll carry on. And finally, chop. If I use that, that'll remove the section and close the samples back together again. So it cuts out what I've chosen and glues it back together. So I'm just going to exit that because I don't want to play around with my loop for the moment. So I'm just going to exit. Again, it's warning me. Again now. Next to this, we've got F3, which is scale. Now, that just means rescale a sample. Basically, this operation can make the sample louder or quieter. We can choose the gain level to adjust it to. So I could go negative or positive in that. Or alternatively, I could just normalize the sample by pressing F5. It asks me if I want to overwrite the existing sample. Yes. And it's now normalized the sample. Basically what it's done is it's increased the sampler's gain, or at least the sample there, so that the loudest parts are hitting the limits of the sampler's headroom. Now, the final parameter on here that I want to talk about is fade here. Basically, that allows us to fade the sample in and out. It's worth applying fade in and outs to individual samples, because if you recall, we can only apply envelopes to key groups, not to individual samples. So using the fade command here, we can actually employ a simple attack decay envelope on the sample. For now, what we need to do is we need to clear this sample again and sample something else, so we can look at how to use what is, I think, perhaps the most powerful and familiar sound of the Akai samplers, and that's time stretching. So for this example, I'm thinking of sampling a vocal sound because it's going to produce more entertaining results for the editing that we want to perform here. So let's get the sampler switched on. Obviously, we have to give it a minute to start looking for the hard disk before we can do anything. And we're just going to skip that. Again, I'm going to edit the sample there. I'm going to do it over the sine wave. As before, I can choose any one, but I'm just going to copy it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So I just hit name there, and I can call it what I want. We're going to sample a vocal sample, so I'm just going to call it Vox, which is V-O-X. Just move to the right one, so it's nice and clean. We'll enter that, and I'm going to copy it. And there's our Vox sample. Then I'm going to go to record page 1. I'll change that to stereo. We'll monitor the left. We know our input level. I'm going to leave monitoring on for the moment. And then our record time, I'm going to set that to 3 seconds because it's not a very long sample. We're going to go to our record 2 page, and here we'll just set threshold about there and arm the sampler. I say. And there's our sample. Now, the first thing I'd like to do here is go over into our editing 2 page. Actually, I'll go into our editing 3 because the first thing I'm going to do is scale it first of all. So I'm just going to hit the scale there. I'm going to normalize our sample and overwrite it. I say. And there we go. Back to our select. And first of all, I think I'm going to go into the first edit one, and I'm going to loop this sample. Actually, I might trim it first. We'll clear it up a little bit. So obviously, you know this function by now. We just zoom in there. See, it's missed a little bit off the beginning there, which we may want to keep. So I'm just going to set it to there, and then we'll cut that, cut it away. Then we're going to go zoom out a little bit, look at the back end of the sample to there, and I'm just going to go there. I'm going to zoom in. So we can see there's a little bit of a sample there, so I'm just going to set that a little bit longer. Cutting the end off. I'll cut that there. So now we've trimmed our sample. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to loop part of it. I'm going to explain why in a moment, but the first thing we need to do, I'm going to do loop 1. I'm going to set my time here to 9999, which changes that to a hold. You know all this by now. I'm just going to set this quite early, and then actually set that a little bit further over, further. I don't want to loop an awful lot of this. I want to keep it quite small. I'm going to say there, and then we're going to move to this one. We'll just go to there. Say round about there. I say. So I've looped the sample. So the next thing we're going to do is going to go back to our select page there, and we're going to go to the edit 2 page there. Now, this gives us parameters Now in the parameter page, we can adjust the basic sample parameters. For example, I sampled this at C3. So that means that when I play C3 on my keyboard, it's going to play the original sample. However, I can always change this to any other pitch note on the keyboards. For example, if I set this to C2, C2 will play the original sample. I'm not going to bother with that for the moment. I just want to explain this page in case you come across it. Offset, I shouldn't really need to describe that one. It just basically changes the pitch in semitones and cents. Now, the type of playback here, right, loop in release. What's going to happen there is the sample's going to play back through all the loops until the first hold loop is reached. And then when you release the key, the hold loop will continue to play as the release falls away. So if we use a long release and I was to play this vocal with loop in release, it will loop what I've looped. And then as I release that key, it will continue to play that loop section and fade it away. Now the next one I think is loop until release. That's it. Now with this one, the sample plays with all the loops until the first hold loop is reached. But when the key is released, the remaining part of the sample will continue to play. The next one I think is no looping. Yeah, no looping. Simple enough. It plays the sample throughout for as long as the key is held. And then the final one I think is play to sample end. Yeah, play to sample end. What happens there is the sampler plays through to the very end. And then there we have the loop tune in offset. Now this is quite interesting. So I'm going to set this back to loop in release there. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the loop tune offset here for the hold area. And you'll be able to hear what happens as I hold this down. I say so basically, when the sample hits its loop point, it changes the tuning. Now, the final parameter on this page is just reverse their FA. I'm not going to use that because I'm sure you all know what reverse sample does. So that'll just reverse it. So you can reverse the sample and reverse it back again. Now, these can all be useful parameters, particularly when we get into creating these huge kicks, because often we have to adjust the original pitch when layering. But what I really want to talk about in this session is the classic time stretching of the Akai samplers. And we're going to get that under F3 time there. So I've got to explain some of these because it can seem a bit strange when you first look at all this. First of all, we have the stretch zone here. Now, this is how much of the sample we want to stretch or time compress. You see, often we don't want to stretch the initial transient of a sound because it'll slur it, and that can have a negative effect on where it sits in the mix. So using the stretch zone here, we can choose to bypass the transient and just stretch or time compress the latter half. Now, really, before I start stretching, what I need to do is I need to go back here. I need to go to the edit one, and I want to go to my loop there. And I want to turn this off. So I'm going to turn it off there. So now it's just going to play all the way through with no looping. This is just to make it easier when we start to play with our time stretching. So we can choose to miss the original part of the sample, or we can choose to do the latter half. Now, because it's very, very short here, now that is far too short, to be completely honest with you. So we're going to set that a lot longer to the full length of the sample. Should make this a bit quicker. There, we got the full length of the sample. And of course, we could miss the initial transient, but I'm not going to do that just for this particular example because I want you to hear the effect it has. Now, we can use zone here while we're setting these to listen to what's happening to the sample. So for example, if I set this later, I could just press the zone button and it would only play the part that we're going to time stretch. This comes in quite useful, the F6 zone, if we need to use it. Now, the next one is our cycle length here. This sets the cycle length in samples. If you're cycling or looping a sample, it will try to find a good loop point. Now, that only applies during the time stretching though. I'm going to leave that out because I don't want to cycle anything. So the next thing is the time factor there. This is the percentage that the sample will be stretched or time compressed. If we go into negative, it will compress the sample. If we go into positive, it will time stretch it. Now, when you change this, you can see the difference between the normal time of the sample and the time of the sample you're going to create. There. So the time, we're making it longer, the sample. If I set that back to 100, and then you see our sample is 2.51 seconds. As I lengthen that, see our sample gets longer and longer. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go silly here. I'm going to go to, what's that, 616% there. So the next thing we need to choose is our stretch mode. Now, when it says cyclic, essentially that's for drums and loop-based material. If we change this, it'll change to intelligent, or Intel there anyway. That means intelligent. It produces better results but takes longer to process. Now, this isn't a rule. In some of my tracks, I've used cyclic mode when stretching a vocal line just because it sounds even more trashy, and sometimes that's the effect you may want. Now, next to that, we have the quality value there. This adjusts the quality. I think the best way of talking about this is basically it's the number of decisions the sampler makes as it works through stretching it. It's going to make 10 different decisions there. You lower that down, that's going to get worse and worse, or you can take it all the way up. It depends. Sometimes, typically when you're stretching in these samplers and you want that sampler sound, you want quite a low quality. I usually set this between 5 and 8. So I'm going to set it on 8. It should make sense, but obviously higher values will result in better quality. But as I say, when using these machines, we're after that character, so we don't always want really clean sounds. You need to differentiate between why you're using your sampler here and in software. If you want clean perfection, you might as well stay in the box like everyone else. But if you want that dirty or kind of different sound, which is what we're going out to these things for, then you don't want to attempt to keep things clean. So feel free to experiment. And then finally, we have the width there. That sets the crossfade value between the interpolation values. In other words, if we create larger interpolation values through making a sample longer, the higher width settings will create more of a crossfade between those values. But that only actually works if this is on intelligent. If you change that to cyclic, it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. Well, I've noticed it doesn't do anything. It only seems to do anything really on intelligent. So you only really want to use width when you're setting to intelligent. Now, the main thing to remember here is that in order to time stretch, we need to assign a location or a sample for the newly stretched sample to sit into. You see, you can't overwrite the sample that you're stretching. So what we need to do is, as always, we need to press our name there, and we need to name our sample. So I'm going to call this Vox, don't know, keep it quiet. We said Vox S for now. So we've got it there. And we just press enter. So what we can say is our sample is Vox, and our new sample when we stretch it will be Vox S, which is obviously Vox stretched. So once we're ready, all we need to do is press the F7, go. And it'll tell you the time to go there. So we've just got to wait a few minutes. These are old machines, so you've got to be patient. And there we go. So what we can do now is we can actually play the original sample by pressing the enter play button. I say. Or we can play the time stretch version by pressing the play button here. That's the classic Akai sound of time stretching. It's a sound you've undoubtedly heard before, and it's also a sound that is still in use today, although smaller stretch values, we tend to use those to create kind of slurry snares, deep basses, interesting vocals. And the amount of producers using shorter time stretch values to create these kind of interesting timbres is gradually growing. Obviously, I've used an extreme value there because I wanted you to hear what it can do, but if you play up and down the keyboard, it produces even more interesting sounds. And I want to go into the more creative uses of time stretching in season 2 of our sampler series here. Now, once we've got our new time stretch sample, we can always do whatever we want with it. We could go back to our select there. We could go into edit 1. Obviously, we've got to make sure we've chosen our stretched vocal there. But we could go in and we could loop parts of this. But once we're in there, we could then loop that if we wanted to. I don't want to do this again because I'm going to be doing the same thing over and over again. So we're going to go back to our select. We're going to go back to our edit 2. And the final one I want to talk about here is the rate under F4. Now, basically, rate allows you to resample your sample. It's mostly used to save space. For example, if a sample doesn't exhibit a high harmonic content, then you don't need such a high sampling rate. I mean, a kick drum doesn't need a sampling rate of 44.1. And in fact, sampling kicks, snares, and hats and then crushing their values in here is a well-known production trick for techno house and tech house producers. Now, there's our present sample rate, and we could drop it right down to a completely different sample rate. As before, we'd have to name it and create a new sample. So I could, for example, name this Vox, and we know it's the stretched one, but I could call this Vox stretched, say RES for resample, something like that. And then we just click the enter there, and we'd save it there when we decide to lower it down. Now, we can change this value, and obviously here we've got quality, which is pretty obvious. That'll adjust the quality of it. Then you're going to notice we have new length down here. Now, the reason for that is it's going to show the new length in milliseconds. If I change this, you can see how the new length changed. But more importantly, note how the tune offset changes as well. I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see this change a little bit more. Notice there how the tune offset changes.
If you're not a member yet, I'd like to invite you to go to aes.org/join and become a member today. An AES membership carries incredible value, talks with experts, networking opportunities, a wealth of knowledge in the e-library, with papers dating back to the earliest days of AES. The AES Live videos, with an extraordinary collection of educational videos from the most notable experts and on topics ranging from recording and production, EDM, forensic audio, hip-hop and R&B, game audio, immersive audio, live sound, and so much more. And this is not even including access to all the events, conferences, conventions, symposia, institutes, and academies. We have many great events coming up in 2021 and many opportunities to learn, connect, and come together. So if you're not a member, join today.
Come on, up again, come on. Come on, AES, on your feet.
Thank you so much.